Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story about how a stable, functioning state was pushed right to the absolute brink of collapse. We're going to do a forensic audit of the fiscal crisis in Puntland to really understand how the whole system failed, and maybe who was pulling the strings.
So let's just jump right into the central mystery here. You see, for decades, Puntland was seen as this rock of stability in Somalia. It was actually working. And then it felt like almost overnight the government just went broke. So how does that even happen? How does a state that's paying its people, securing its borders, suddenly find its treasury completely empty?
And this is where it gets real, right? This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet anymore. Think about it. The very people who are the backbone of a society, your teachers, your nurses, the police, were suddenly left with absolutely nothing. This wasn't some natural disaster. The social fabric was literally unraveling because of a man-made one.
And let's be super clear, we are not talking about some brief administrative hiccup here. We're talking about a devastating 9-month salary arrear. I mean, just imagine going almost a full year without a single paycheck. This created a genuine humanitarian catastrophe. It pushed families deep into debt, forcing them to make impossible choices just to survive. So what on earth went wrong? Well, this slide right here, it reveals the critical vulnerability. Take a look. In 2023, things looked pretty balanced, right? But notice that almost half of the entire budget came from international aid. This created what the analysis calls the stability trap. Basically, Puntland became so stable and so professional that it became dangerously dependent on one single source of outside money.
So how was this vulnerability exploited? This is where the story gets really interesting. This wasn't a war fought with guns and bombs. Oh no. It was fought with bureaucracy. And the weapon of choice was a simple signature.
Okay, so here's the crucial point you have to understand. It's a concept called statutory sovereignty. To the big players, the World Bank, the UN, Somalia is basically one house with one single front door, and that door is in Mogadishu. What this means is that every single dollar of aid meant for a teacher in Puntland had to pass through this single pipe, a single choke point controlled entirely by the central government.
And this right here illustrates the weapon perfectly. To get any money out of that pipe and into Puntland's accounts, a federal official had to sign off. This sovereign signature was essentially a tap that could turn the flow of life-sustaining aid on, or, just as easily, turn it right off.
And that is exactly what happened. The analysis shows the central government didn't need to declare a war or even publicly cancel the aid. All they had to do was stop signing the papers. They buried salary funds in endless technical reviews. It was financial asphyxiation in slow motion, a bureaucratic siege that gave them complete deniability to the outside world.
So, with its public funds totally cut off, Puntland was being pushed into a corner. And as if that financial siege wasn't bad enough, the state found itself facing a second, much more violent threat at the exact same time. The government was staring down a truly agonizing choice. I mean, what do? Option A, you use what little local money you have left to pay civil servants and just try to prevent society from completely collapsing from the inside. Or, option B, you fund a desperate war against a surge of ISIS extremists who are threatening to overrun the state's most strategic mountain ranges.
They chose survival. To fund Operation Hilak, a really high-intensity mountain campaign against ISIS, Puntland was forced to siphon $72 million from its own local tax revenues. And you have to understand, this was the money that represented the last glimmer of hope for paying its civil servants. Every single dollar spent on fuel and ammunition was a dollar taken directly from the mouth of a teacher's family. And the pressure just didn't stop there. A second siege was launched, this time targeting Puntland's very last economic lifeline, the sea. First, bam! Mogadishu declares the main port unauthorized, which caused shipping insurance costs to just explode. Then, they took control of the fishing licenses right off Puntland's own coast, diverting all that revenue away from the state and straight back to the central government.
But you've got to be asking yourself, why? Why was all of this allowed to happen? Why did the international community just stand by while a stable region was being starved? Well, to understand that, we need to zoom out and take a look at the bigger geopolitical chessboard.
The analysis points to what it calls a double-face strategy from global powers, particularly the US. Publicly, you had the velvet glove, all smiles and handshakes, praising Somali unity. But privately, it was the iron fist, financial policies, like that single pipe system, that gave the central government all the power it needed to enforce the blockade.
And this timeline, wow, it shows how all of these pressures just converged into a perfect storm in 2025. You've got the port blockade kicking into high gear. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Israel recognizes Somaliland, creating a new strategic competitor right next door. And all the while, U.S. Treasury policies aimed at de-risking international finance were creating a remittance strike, making it harder and harder for Somalis abroad to send money home, choking off that last source of private cash for ordinary families.
So what was the end game here? The analysis points to this doctrine called managed fragmentation. And the theory is basically this. It's easier to control a region if you keep it broken into small, weak, dependent pieces. Keep Puntland just strong enough to fight terrorists for you, but keep it too broke to ever truly control its own economic destiny or become a real regional player.
So with the state on the verge of becoming a hollow shell, strong on the outside but completely collapsing from within, how on earth did the siege finally break? Well, this is where the story shifts from desperation to just a stunning display of resilience.
In one single, incredibly dramatic week in January 2026, everything changed. First, Puntland's own people showed this amazing loyalty, helping the government raise a record amount in local taxes. Then, the European Union, realizing that a collapsed Puntland served no one's interests, made a historic move to bypass Mogadishu and send aid directly. And finally, the international community met in Nairobi and officially rejected the port blockade, restoring Puntland's access to the sea.
And this right here, this was the killer blow to the blockade. This communiqué from the European Union was a political earthquake. It effectively neutralized the sovereign signature as a weapon. The EU was saying, loud and clear, we will not be complicit in the strategy of starvation any longer.
So after all of that, what's the final verdict from our forensic audit? What does this trial by fire really mean for the future of Puntland and for Somalia as a whole?
Well, the breakthrough didn't just end the crisis, it absolutely shattered the old way of doing things. That centralized, single-pipe aid model, it's broken. Puntland's control over its own coastline is now recognized. And maybe most importantly, that massive $72 million security debt is being paid off, and civil servants are finally receiving their salaries.
So the key takeaway from this entire crisis is a major push to move away from that flawed federal system. The proposed path forward is a confederation. In this model, strong states like Puntland control their own money and their own security, and they only delegate very limited, specific powers to a central body instead of having their very survival depend on.
You know, the Puntland crisis was an excruciating test of resilience, but by surviving it, it may have forged a completely new path forward. And that leaves us with one final provocative question. Is this the blueprint for a new, more stable Somalia, one built not from the top down, but from the ground up?